Hello everyone, welcome to Career Conversations. Myself, Dale Ayres, and Jennifer Kwan here with me, and today we are talking about leadership. We will be talking about leadership within a position of management. We'll be talking about leadership within the team context, and leadership just in terms of general qualities that people want to be displaying as a permanent fixture in your professional life. We have had questions, or we've had people within the college asking us about this, about how they are able to demonstrate leadership qualities, why they're being asked about leadership qualities in interviews that aren't for management positions. And I think it's important that we touch on this just to help people understand what we're talking about there, what companies are talking about when they're asking you about the leadership qualities in that context. So I suppose the good thing would be to start off today talking about the obvious part to begin with, leadership within the context of a managerial position. When people are coming to you and it's a one-way relationship, you are doing for them or you are leading them, not the other way around, usually coming from a point of a managerial position. And then we'll move on later to the leadership qualities in a team player, a member of a team, and also then demonstrating these things in interview and in your CV. So Jen, leadership in a management position. I'll hand over. I've just done the easy bit just to talk about what we're going to talk about, and then now I'm going to hand over to you just to add some substance to this while I gather my thoughts.
Yeah, so the leadership, I guess, as Dale said, that there's two different ways that we can think about this, and one of the contexts that we're going to start talking about is in that dependency role that Dale has mentioned. So for the students that are coming to NCI, there's two different positions that we were really thinking where this might be relevant. So it could be that you are coming from an experience background where you maybe are doing a course and going back into the workplace, but you might have actually had leadership experience managing a team. You might have been a project manager. There's something around where you have managed people. So the leadership experience that you've had is all around leading other people to get things done. The other position of leadership, which is kind of similar, would be in an HR context. So there are a lot of times working as an HR professional, while you're not directly managing people, the people in an office might be coming to you for advice around things. They're looking for your guidance. So in a sense, that is offering leadership. So maybe the first thing that we should talk about is when you are in either of those situations, how do you actually demonstrate leadership in an interview situation or going to that? And what does that leadership look like, whether you have the experience or whether you're going into a role where you're expected to be able to be confident in a position like that? So maybe, Dale, do you want to maybe talk about what some of the more obvious skills as a leader might be that would be good for a student to maybe demonstrate on a CV or in the early stages of an application process?
Sure. I think that there are like the obvious things that people are going to be looking for in a managerial thing is, if you have managed people, then they're going to want to know the number of people you've managed. One of the kind of the direct reports is, a very good thing to demonstrate on your CV, how many direct reports you were responsible for. If it's from a project management position, like what are the size of your teams, what are the budgets that you've been responsible for, and kind of to give an idea of the gravity of the situation that you've been involved in. So these are good things, like really basic things just to demonstrate on your CV, and sometimes in a cover note, depending on whether the context of what you're applying to, and your ability then to convey how you kind of bring these situations about, the situations that you're responsible for, how you bring them about to a successful conclusion or a successful ongoing situation, is really good. When it comes to a CV or a cover note, when it's always good to try and demonstrate value add. We try to, it's almost impossible, I would say, to do a CV that doesn't include the responsibilities that you had in the situation. But the main thing that you are hoping to kind of include in your CV is the situations where you've added value to a situation and what that situation was. Similar to when you're in an interview situation, we're going through the STAR model, so situation, task, action, and result, and you're trying to help somebody understand how you added value to a situation, or how you did something in that situation. So in terms of the leadership context, on a CV, you really do need to kind of help yourself, and it's a task in itself almost to get an entire situation where you have added value as a leader, or you've taken on a leadership role within a bullet point that helps you helps demonstrate how you've added value or succeeded as a leader in that area or as a manager in that area. So that's something that's really important to do, but you should do it. You shouldn't rely on just saying what your responsibilities were, because it's very easy to see where somebody has just taken their old job spec, cut and pasted it, and put it into a CV. It doesn't add the same sort of value as when you've explained something that you've done. One of the things I have seen done on project management CVs, I've not seen it done on too many management position CVs, probably only one or two, but I've seen this with project managers quite a bit, is they have their 2-page CV. And they've managed to kind of whittle down their experience, their education into a certain section, and then they have given a 3rd page, which is, you know, the taboo third page.
The taboo third page.
The taboo third page,
which you never allowed to speak in.
The taboo third page has been a selection, maybe 2 or 3 selections of projects that they have run. And what was involved, so that because you can put in your CV, you know, I was a project manager, or I was a manager of this team, blah blah blah. You can only get so much into that without it becoming boring or difficult to read. So what you can do is to sort of refer, like in School of Computing, my students, I say to them, like, avoid the 3rd page at all costs, but if you're going to put your technologies in there, your technology table, to help people understand your technologies, I say you can put that in a table at the back of the page. When it comes to the management position, I would also say the same thing for, like, you know, people in management positions or project managers, as I've sort of seen. You can put this in the back of your CV, refer to, like, you know, this is a few examples of the projects I've led, or the teams I've led, or the situations that I've dealt with as a leader that I think are going to be relevant for this job. And then you can give like a paragraph of writing. It's there as an option. They don't have to read it. It's not blocking your CV. It's not stopping them from getting through your CV and they kind of wade through it. They know it's at the back because you've referred to it very succinctly and quickly. If they want to know more, they can go in there. It's like an addition to your cover note. You know, it's the sort of thing that if you put it in your cover note would be too long. So you don't put it in your cover note, but you can stick it at the back. And it's just like, if I want to know more about what this person has done, then this is a really good way of doing it. So that is, from my experience and what I've seen, a good way of helping somebody to understand what you've done in a leadership position or a project management like position, and help them to kind of, you know, see a little bit more about what you've done. And also it gives you the opportunity, a risky opportunity, I would say, because sometimes jobs are hard to understand from a job spec, but it does give you the opportunity to write down what you think is relevant to the people looking at this. And that's in itself, if you hit the nail on the head with that, if you get that right, then you have then demonstrated that you know what's going on here. Of course, if you get it wrong, it could be almost as detrimental, because you could end up, they could go, this guy just doesn't get it. But that's one of the ways I would say is a good way of demonstrating your ability to lead on an application, in a CV, a cover note, in that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's important, maybe it might be a good idea just to circle back to that idea around, it's not just about listing responsibilities, but it's about talking about the impact that you actually had as a leader. So I actually just was trying to find a couple examples. So I thought that it might be helpful to kind of show how this would actually be phrased in a cover letter situation or even on a CV. So this could just be for somebody who maybe you are working in HR, maybe you've worked in a bar, maybe you've been a supervisor in a restaurant or something like that, working part-time or over the summers. And I know a lot of the students in NCI have that experience. So rather than just saying, you know, I was a manager in a bar, what you want to be saying is something like, I trained bar staff of 25 people to ensure that, let's say, that they were ready for open night on customer service skills. This resulted in ensuring that we increased the number of tips, so that you're talking about some sort of impact that you've had. So your training has done X, Y, and Z, which has meant that you've got better reviews in your restaurant, you've had a certain impact, which is a benefit. So not only were you in a leadership position, but you actually did something positive in that leadership position where you got people to do their jobs better, and the result had something positive on the business. So when you're talking in your cover notes or in your CV, it's really important to do that. And if you can, come up with percentages. So you might say that, you know, improved ratings by 5%, going from a 4.5 to a 5, right, over my 6 months as acting manager or supervisor, or something like that. So using those kind of metrics really helps make a CV stronger, but also kind of helps give a little bit of context around what did you actually do as a supervisor or as a manager in those positions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really important, you know, like the quantifiability of it, the numbers of it are really important. I find that a lot of people, myself included, actually, I wouldn't necessarily pay enough attention to certain areas like that, where I'd be like, do I know exactly what my numbers were that day? And that, like, if you said to me, like, what's the top number of things I've done in my job, or what's the most, like, I can probably point back to some numbers and go, yeah, well, I know that on this day, date, time and place I got that much, and at this period in my career I was on the top 10 or the top 3 or whatever. But, like, you know, and this is why while you're working, it's important to kind of make a note of this in your head, because if you can put that on a CV, it's brilliant. Like, it really is important. Not important, but it's important, but it's more a case of it's powerful for you to be able to do that. But if you can't, if, like most people, you haven't remembered the numerical impact of it, you can talk about it in descriptive ways as well, and certainly add value to it in that way.
Yeah. And, you know, I had an example of a girl the other day, and I was looking at her CV, and she was talking about her experience in the bar, and she, you know, she had the generic, you know, worked at the till, did this, did that. And I said, well, what is the most, like, impactful thing that you think you've done? And she said that actually one of her roles was training staff members on certain things. And one of the issues they had in the hotel was that a lot of people would come down from, they weren't part of the hotel, or they were in the hotel, they wouldn't give their room numbers, and then they would just get up and leave. So essentially a lot of bills ended up being unpaid. And people realized that they could do this, and just by pretending to essentially be hotel guests. So one of the main trainings that she implemented was making sure that when customers sat down, they were either providing a room number that was then checked, and if they weren't providing a room number, you knew that you had to go and actually give them a bill and collect money at the end of the meal. But one of those things that she managed to get going down, up from having 4 or 5 tables leaving without paying per night, getting that down to 0 payments by implementing that training. It's like, well, that's something that is an excellent leadership quality. You've identified where there's a problem, and then you've resolved that problem. And maybe it's hard to kind of say, well, reduce it from 5 to 0 every single day. Maybe that's not quite accurate, but you can definitely describe how you've come up with, figured out where there's a problem, identified how to fix the problem, and then implemented a change that actually fixes it. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one, I guess that's the essence of what you're looking to do as a leader, you know, is solve problems and to show other people how to solve problems, you know, and that's partly what you're mainly.
And to demonstrate that actually, do you know what, there's, as a waitress or a waiter, maybe it is a little bit more awkward to be kind of chasing people for money, essentially, right? And that's maybe an uncomfortable thing to do, but actually then part of the training is, well, do you know what, if they don't pay, then they don't put in tips, and if this continues, then the bar is going to lose money, and we can't really afford to do that, which then puts your job at risk in a way. So in that training session, there has to be a part of connecting with people that you're trying to persuade to change their behaviors, and all of that stuff about being empathetic with people and convincing them and persuading them that they need to change something in order to have a result. All of that is a very strong leadership quality in numerous ways, right? So just being able to talk about that is in an interview situation, and being able to concisely put that in a CV is really, really important in demonstrating leadership skills without directly saying leadership skills gained from. Right?
Yeah. In terms of the qualities that people look for in leaders, like leaders and managers, we're still kind of in this arena, what do we think are the really important things that people look for in a leader? When we're talking about, like, somebody saying, like, what leadership qualities do you possess? What do you think are important traits in a leader? Manager, I should use the word manager really, so that we kind of differentiate for the two areas we're looking at. But what are the important areas that, you know, or what are the important qualities for a manager to have? What are we kind of looking at here? How are we demonstrating these things?
So I think this is going to be, all businesses are going to have different ideas about what makes a great manager, and that is largely going to depend on their organizational setup as well. So I think, if you're looking at a very hierarchical organization, there's definitely going to be a lot about how do you actually drive results in a way of your team, right? It's probably very metrics focused in that sense. If you're potentially looking at a flatter organization where you do still have a team, but it's a little bit less tiered, perhaps, then maybe one of the leadership qualities is actually more about how do you get people to work best across different functions, because you do have that flatter structure. So that's just a very simple example of how I think it does change a lot, and organizations will be quite clear about the things that they value. But I think one of the, overall, if you are managing a team, that leadership is demonstrated by, are you able to get people to do what you want them to do, essentially, right? And that can come in the form of metrics. It can become, it's a performance-based result in a way, right? It's potentially about how much can you engage people, how much can you manage tasks within a team setting. So depending on what your role is, perhaps you have a number of different tasks, and are you able to effectively divide those tasks amongst your team based on your team's strengths? If you're going into a more senior position where perhaps you're trying to recruit people, are you able to understand what elements you're missing within your team to work properly as a team, and can you identify those and then recruit for them? That would also be very applicable to HR, as well as identifying how is a team working and where are they maybe missing a particular personality type or strength within that. And then I think you've just got that there has to be an empathy and people factor as well, right? That a good leader understands what the rest of the team needs from them. You can talk about leadership styles in terms of, do you have a team with entry-level graduates, with very senior people in it, and are you trying to manage what each person needs? Because they're going to need very, very different things, and some people on your team might need very little instruction from you. They might just basically need your own sign-off to go ahead and do things, whereas other people might need a lot more direction, and other people might need a lot more coaching. So being able to manage those different needs of your team is also really, really important. There's probably some more specific ones that you can name there, Dale, but I think that would be I think one of the main issues that I've, working from an HR perspective, that have come up with managers, where we're saying, is this manager effective? And do they get results? Are they effective at managing the strengths of their team based on the level that their team members are at? And do they understand what the organization actually needs from them, working within their team, within the requirements of other teams or a bigger departmental function?
Absolutely. And I think that there's kind of, it's almost like a two-part sort of area where you're kind of looking at in this, like, do you have the ability to do what you need to as a manager? But then also the other part of it is, what skills, techniques, what qualities are you going to employ in order to achieve what you have to do? So there is the whole thing of kind of understanding where the weaknesses are, and understanding what needs to be done in order to make that team effective and to get those things going on, and they're really important. And then the other side of it, I suppose, is like, how do you demonstrate, or what is your technique? What do you think is important quality for you to possess as a leader for this team, or any team? And I think that can be something that is very important to think about, at least before you go into an interview, because even if you don't directly get asked that one question, you might be able to demonstrate those qualities in the answers you give of how you effectively managed a team. So things like, understanding the focus of your organization and what your team does in order to try and complement that focus, and think that's something that's very important. But also, one of the things I think is important, as I said earlier, I just asked my wife before coming up here. She's a director in her company, and I said, like, what does a leader, like, what does a leader mean to you? Like, what does the term leader mean to you, if you can sum it up in one sentence? And she said, well, never trying to get somebody else to do something that you would never have done, or wouldn't be prepared to do. So being fair. She also mentioned about being transparent and open and honest, which I think are very important qualities as well. sometimes tricky qualities, because you do have this element of, will this person that I'm speaking to understand the bigger picture if I am open and honest with them about that? Most people are, and I've made the mistake before about thinking that everybody is able to understand the bigger picture, and then being quite honest with them about things, to find that they actually really do not think beyond themselves, and then that almost causes them to freeze up, and becomes like, being honest with some people that can't grasp the bigger picture then becomes a problem, because their attitude changes towards their own, and they're very like personal focused rather than corporate, like, you know, globally focused. And then that can, but generally speaking, most people, especially in the professional world now, and especially with like how difficult it is to get into a job, like, there's very few jobs you get into now that have any level of responsibility or trust in them that you just get into via one interview. You know, there's a big like interview process that goes on in order to make sure that the right people get into roles. And I think more and more the workplace is very much filled with loads and loads of people that do understand the bigger picture, that can reason. And the people that are very close-minded, thinking only of themselves, in this position only for themselves, that they're diminishing. So that open and honesty side of things, I think, is very important, and there's much more room for it. And what's it?
Sorry, if there's actually an element of, I was just thinking about that kind of open and honest thing, and about how important I think it is to have maybe consistency in your leadership style as well. I think that even going back to the fact that I've done a lot of sports leadership as a coach, or as a captain and stuff like that, I think that sometimes you know, open and honest can mean very different things to different people. I think, right? And a degree of openness and a degree of honesty is partly going to depend on the sector that you work in, and the type of business that you're in as well, because sometimes you may know information that you really just cannot share. So open and honest, it has a scale, right? But also understanding your own leadership style and how open and honest you are is important. But I think it is really important as a manager to be consistent with that. It's incredibly confusing to people who report into you if one day you're telling them everything and the following day you're telling them nothing. Or one day you were almost micromanaging and giving loads of directions, and then the following week you haven't given any instruction whatsoever. And those things, in terms of consistency, depending on what type of thing you're trying to manage, one may be more appropriate than the other. But I think understanding your own leadership style, and also being really aware as a manager of what am I not good at and what am I good at, is incredibly important, because acknowledging that, okay, everybody, these are things that I'm not the strongest at, right? Maybe I'm not the best at dealing with these things, but being open about that is going to earn a lot of more respect and trust from your team than trying to cover it up. And that can also be a manager, right?
And that also can help people understand changes that come along. You know, you talk then about like somebody that's micromanaging one day and then not the next, or is being really open one day and then not the next. That is where a certain level of honesty can come in. It's just like them stepping away from you, and but like, you know, saying nothing about it will be like, that's a bit weird. But them stepping away from you, go, look, I realize I'm being probably a little bit too micromanagey, and I'm going to step away a little bit just to give you some space, because I don't want to suffocate you. So that's what's going to happen here, and I'm just going to step back for a little bit just to see how you get on, and we'll regroup in a couple of weeks, and see like where we're at. What do I need to keep stepping in, you know, and not from a necessarily a controlling point of view, but just from a, I'm a person. I'm trying to make this thing work, and doesn't necessarily I'm the best person for the job. It's just the person that I'm in this job, and this is what I'm doing. This is what the company needs me to do. So I'm doing this now, you know, and I think that's something that is very important. And I think one of the bigger things as well is the ability to listen. I was watching something this morning where they were saying, like, you know, your ability to listen and adapt as you learn is really important as a leader. And I think it's both in a managerial position and in a team position, where, like, you know, it's okay to change your mind. It's okay to learn. It's okay to progress. You know, that's what we hope we do. You don't want to come into a job doing it one way and leave 20 years later doing it the exact same way, having not improved just because, you know, whatever you've done. So that's, you know, when you listen and learn and you develop and grow, there's always going to be an element where you say, the way we did it was good at the time, but it's not anymore compared to what everybody else is doing, and we need to change. So this is what we're going to try, you know. And there's that element of listening out and trying to be guided, but also making sure that everybody's with you, and the openness and honesty side of it. But I think that is, you know, a really important element to the actual managerial leader.
Yeah. And I do think, like, going, you know, you can look up like leadership styles. I know when I was coaching, they all used to just laugh at me, and they'd be, oh, that's just such a Jen thing to say, or it's a very, you know, like there'd be things like that. But actually, because I was consistent in it, it meant that they, you know, and they'd be like, well, we all just know that Jen's expectations are, you know, 20% higher than a humanly achievable, but that's okay, because we just know that, right? So, and that actually what really matters is that there's a bar of expectation set here, but actually really it's X amount that you put into it that really counts. So that's okay, but as long as I'm consistent with that, and it's not one day I'm expecting this, the next day I'm expecting that, and sometimes you get rewarded for this and sometimes you don't, but it's being able to develop a relationship where people trust what your expectations are, but that also that you believe that people can hit those expectations, and not being sort of too lenient for the sake of building relationships with your team, but also not being so harsh that you don't build those relationships. And there's a very fine balance between those two things, I think, that does come with time and experience, and is not something that you necessarily are going to have just coming straight out of college.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the things that end up being leadership qualities for managerial positions are things that you develop over time and you learn over time, which is why you don't generally tend to get somebody who's never worked before going straight into a leadership position, unless, like we've spoken about, like it's possibly an HR position where you don't necessarily realize it when you're going into it in an HR position, but you are immediately in a leadership position, having literally just walked out of school almost, and that can be quite a daunting thing. And maybe this is the time to talk about that level, like how you fit into that situation, because people will be coming to you not for your own benefit but for their benefit, and you are the leader there. They're expecting you to know what to do, and you need to have your knowledge about you, but you also need to have the presence of mind to be able to manage the situation that you're in as the person you are, and deal with things as it is. And, you know, there's an element of giving yourself the confidence to do that. And how it comes about that. But I think that's an important thing to maybe explore now, is like, you know, the graduate leader, how we kind of, what advice and sort of thing can we give to them?
So I think you know, leadership comes in so many forms, right? And we've talked about the sort of more obvious team leading ones, but leadership, I think, comes, you know, it can come in almost any form, whatever is your strength, right? Gallup has done really interesting studies around strengths of people, and kind of, I guess, trying not to identify people as one thing or another, but looking at trends of, you know, some people will contribute in different ways. You might be extremely analytical and great at metrics. You might be really good at listening to other people and getting other people to contribute to a conversation. You might be exceptional at being really disciplined about what you do, right? So that you actually just, like, I'm sitting down and getting this done. And other people might be exceptionally creative and able to come up with those new ideas that maybe really disciplined people kind of struggle to break out of that box to do. So, but all of those different skills, you can be a leader in that skill. So I think if you don't have the obvious leadership experience, it's really important to work out for yourself and to do a bit of self-investigation and say, well, what am I actually really good at? Because I can probably demonstrate that in some context, I've been a leader at this thing, right? They have done, actually, so Gallup again have done a further study on how strengths and leadership kind of match up. And they did about 20,000 interviews. So it was a huge study that they completed in the US to look at the relationship between how best to use strengths to become a leader in some context. And they really divided up strengths into a few different ways to help, because if you can maximize the use of your strengths, you'll be more engaged in what you're doing. And you'll be able, therefore, to actually demonstrate leadership even better because you're more engaged, and therefore you're driven, and therefore you will actually have an impact on your role. So they talk about the fact that you can be a leadership in an executing perspective. So that's actually more of the traditional idea of, like, getting things done. I have targets. I'm going ahead with the plan. Maybe you're somebody that's really good at influencing people. So you're great at communicating. You're really good at having that sort of like, woo, let's go team.
Yeah, you're likable. Yeah.
Right. And that's a huge leadership quality as well. Maybe it's something that you're able to connect with people. Maybe you have really high empathy. So you are really good at engaging quieter people. Maybe you're good at getting other people to contribute. You're a really good listener. And that's your leadership role within those teams, right? So, or maybe perhaps you're strategic and you are extremely analytical, you are futuristic, maybe you have great ideas. It's those things that have a slightly strategic mindset, and maybe that's the area that you can lead in. So I think whenever you're looking at a CV and maybe a job spec says has leadership, has demonstrated leadership, you can almost take that in any direction that you want, right? And say, well, actually, leadership, I have demonstrated leadership because I took control of this one aspect of a project and was successful at it, right? Or I took responsibility for or ownership of this element of my job that I know I'm really good at. So I know that everyone's a waitress, but the thing that I'm best at is I manage to actually get everyone to buy 3 or 4 course meals and coffees at the end, and no one else manages to do that. Right? So maybe there's a tiny skill that you have there, but that's your leadership skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely important to understand what your strengths are and what you're bringing to that role. And I think that's something that you can have confidence in. I do think that the confidence part of being a leader is an important thing. And I think that you're going to be able to latch onto that by knowing what your strengths are and that sort of thing. And I think for myself, one of the things I would certainly advise people, especially people starting out in a new role in any job really, but especially when you're in a position of perceived leadership, is I think to kind of not expect yourself to know everything. And I saw this a lot in my previous roles that I've worked at, where people that are kind of like quite young or quite inexperienced, feeling like working with a lot of people who have been in their jobs for ages and know what they're doing, they're experts and that sort of thing. I see a lot of people kind of trying to bluff it out, trying to pretend I know what I'm doing, never asking for help, never saying, I actually don't know what I'm talking about here, or I need more help on this, and what it ends up doing is taking, and I'm going to use the word problem, and it's not even really a problem, but taking a tiny problem of not knowing what you're doing in that situation, which is more of a case of it's an opportunity for you to learn, really. It's not really a problem, providing you do the correct thing with that, which is to go and find out what you're supposed to do and then put that into action. But a lot of people bluff it out, try to do the right thing because they're trying to figure it out themselves, get it wrong, and the fallout from that ends up being that now everybody has to make more of an effort because you wouldn't ask, you wouldn't say, I don't know what I'm doing. You need to understand that when you're in a new position, whether leadership or not, when you're in a new position and you don't know what you're doing, the chances are you're not supposed to know what you're doing. You're not supposed to, nobody's expecting you to know. I remember several times when I was a police officer and I'd be working with junior people coming into the police there, and they'd be like, I'd be looking at them and they'd be like almost really, really hesitant to do something, but just kind of walking towards anyone. I was like, do you know what you're doing here? Because I'm not expecting you to know what you're doing. What I am expecting you to do is ask me for help if you don't know what is going on here. And I would much rather tell you 50 times what to do than for you to mess it up and cause a lot more problems for yourself and everybody around you. And I used to see
leadership, right, starts with leading yourself, right?
Yeah.
And if you go onto a graduate program, there's a lot of them will have these kind of courses like leadership program things, right?
Yeah.
And a huge amount of that is around how do I best lead myself? Because if you can't take ownership and responsibility for your own learning and progression and what you're going to do about it when you don't know, it's going to be impossible for you to make any transition to leadership in any other context. Right?
Yeah.
So I think, and coming back to even a more recent example, me and Dale only started our roles as career advisors, 9 months ago at this not even, right? So 18 months ago, and neither of us have done this job before. And in the beginning, we did have to ask a lot of questions. But if we hadn't taken ownership of saying, I don't know what to do with this particular student, this particular situation, how am I supposed to do that? It means that we can never effectively lead and demonstrate those leadership qualities. So it kind of has to start with you understanding what you know and what you don't know, and taking ownership of that.
Yeah, and of course, nobody wants to be in that position, do they? You know, everybody wants to come in and go, I know what I'm doing, and I'm the savior of this department because you've hired me, and I'm now making.
Like, imagine how boring the job would be after 3 months of you having nailed the job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the important things, like if you're going to start, like especially if you're starting out in your career and you want to kind of know what to get over first, I would say one of the most important things is to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, because nobody wants to be the burden. Nobody wants to be the one that's being taught. And the reality of it is that you're going to have to be taught several times about the same thing, probably. Like I can't tell you how many times I've asked Orla to tell me how to work Moodle. I'm still bits on that I don't get, and I'm like, okay, right, I've got my head around it. But I've probably asked Orla about 3 or 4 times about
what FDRs are, right? How many conversations you have had about FDRs?
There's so many things about, like, you know, that don't necessarily make sense immediately because you're looking at it and it's just like, why do we do it this way? And then after a little bit of digging and a little bit of asking, you go, right, now I understand why we do it that way. It's not the best, but this is what we're doing and this is how it works. So we're going to get on with it. But generally speaking, like, not many people feel comfortable with saying, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you help me? We just don't like doing it. Whereas if you can be comfortable and get comfortable with the fact that you will be asking that a lot in every new job you go to, when you're moving on to something, that if you're moving within the same sphere and you might get used to something a little bit more quickly, and you will always be able to bring something to that role. Generally, people aren't going to hire you unless you have something to bring to that role, which is why we teach our students about understanding the importance of getting across who you are and what you can bring to the table. Those two things are important. Is when I talk about the CV structure with my students, it's like people want to know who you are and what you can do. The rest of it is detail. So when you're hired into a role, you've got that job because you're the best person they've spoken to out of everybody for this role right now. So you do have something to bring, but you need to hold on to that knowledge that they want you in that role because you are good at something. And it's something that they value. But you must understand, as a new person in a new job, you are not expected to know everything, but you are expected to take ownership of that lack of knowledge and do the right thing with it. And this is something, whether you're in a managerial position or a team position, is to take ownership of the situation you're in, whether it's a task that you have to do or whether it's a shortfall in your own knowledge. Take ownership of that and do something about it. And this is where it becomes in. And I've heard people do it really well. Like I heard somebody, even when I was in NCI, I heard somebody say things. I think it was Olivia who was sitting behind me, and she was on the phone to somebody, and somebody asked her a question. She said, I'm not really sure of the answer to that. Can I call you back in 5 minutes once I found out what the answer is? And I thought, what a brilliant way of doing it. You know, just like, you know, can you just give me 5 minutes?
They sound a lot like that. I will get
but this is, you know, isn't it? And it is. I thought to myself then, it's like that's something that's an experienced person that knows to say that. Generally speaking, you don't see junior people fresh out of college in a job with the confidence to say, I don't know the answer to that. Can I call you back once I've found it out? But that is what you really do need to do as somebody that's fresh out of college. You don't have work experience. You don't know what you're doing. Allow yourself the ability, allow yourself the opportunity to take ownership of your lack of knowledge. And this is the open and honesty part of it, which is completely acceptable in certainly that situation, and say, I don't know what I'm doing in this particular area, or I don't know the answer to what you're asking. Can I call you back in 5 minutes once I found it out? Because this is my job and I do want to help you, but I don't actually know the answer to that right now. And this is something that you see more and more in people that are experienced and confident in themselves, and less in people that are brand new to a job and looking to impress. Whereas it's actually more impressive to people that are experienced and older, that this person actually knows how to conduct themselves. They know how to own this, and they find out and they come back to it. There's no failure there. There's no lack of respect. In fact, there's a growth in my respect for people that do that, because it's like, I trust this person because I know.
I think that's what, you know, when job specs look for graduates who, and they often use the word initiative, right? So, you know, enthusiastic, like takes initiative, whatever. And actually the taking initiative is more about taking control of your own learning. It's not that they're expecting you to somehow launch some amazing new campaign or a product, or, you know, change the world necessarily within a week of you being there, but it is about taking initiative to find out the stuff that you don't know, to put your hand up and say, I don't know what's going on, or I don't know how to solve this thing, and to take that ownership and responsibility. So I think sometimes when we see these words on a CV, on a job spec that indicate things like this, often all of those words are just looking for self-leadership, and they're testing, can you manage yourself and your own learning and your own progression? One of the huge things that we haven't talked about is getting feedback. And that's something that I think, you know, circling back to that, you don't want to put your hand up and say, I don't know what I'm doing. Get used to getting feedback and start getting really comfortable with needing it, because if you are uncomfortable getting feedback, it's going to be very hard to get better at anything that you do. And feedback, for I think 98% of the time, is not negative feedback. It's feedback to inform you about something. It's feedback to help you with something. It is very rarely that you're going to be receiving feedback that is explicitly negative. So I think, you know, there's a lot of fear in this, but it's something that probably is worthwhile if you're still in college, developing through lecturers. If you don't get a good grade on an essay, go back and get feedback as to why, so that you can do better on the next one. You know,
and I think there's an important element to being able to cope with the negative feedback, in so much as that you need to understand that as a person, as Dale or as Jen or as whoever it is that's listening, you know, the sum of your ability to perform in an area of a job is nothing to do with your value as a person. And this is something that is really important, because if your happiness and your self-confidence and your ability to kind of function well and be happy as a person is hinged entirely on how well you perform, as soon as you have a bad day or you make a mistake, you're not worth anything anymore. And therefore it's really difficult for you to try and take on anything as a person that is in any way critical or highlights something that you've done wrong. And I think it's important for people, when you, like, you know, for anybody really, whether you're young or old in your work area, is to understand that, like, your performance is, you know, you want to be the best, you want to do as well as you can, but don't let this kind of take you down as a person if you do something wrong. These are separate things. These aren't qualifiers as your value as a human being. These are things that qualify you as being good at your job, or improving at your job, or need for improvement in these areas. So one of the things I would certainly always say to people that are, when it comes to like taking on criticism or asking for feedback, is just let it be what it is. Like, if you didn't do very well in your presentation, or your PowerPoint was a bit boring because it went on too long or whatever, that's nothing to do with you as a person. That's to do with the options that you chose that turned out not to be right, so do it different the next time. And that's what I was
in an interesting call the other week with some performance coaches for sports, and it's a company based over in the US, and they were talking about sports is a very obvious example, right, where you can make a mistake in a match which can cost you a match, right? And progression, there's a very immediate make a mistake negative outcome, right? So and whether you want the feedback or not, the feedback is glaring you in the face of you made a mistake, and getting over that sort of like mental hurdle of that can be quite difficult for players. So one thing that we were talking about is, how do you mentally prepare for negative feedback? And one of the things that we talked about is going back to that, it's not me as a bad person. It's not even me as a bad employee or a bad player or whatever it is. It's one thing that I did that was not good. Right? And
the nature of what you do involves mistakes.
Exactly. It's that one action. And one of the things that we thought was actually really good to think about in terms of, well, even if it's going to ask for feedback, right, is putting on a a hat that basically says, well, past Jen did this thing. I'm going to find out what past Jen should have done instead, right? But it's not current Jen, it's not future Jen. We're not making an assessment on my future ability to do something, or even my current ability to do something. All we're talking about is the past self, which no longer even exists. Because it's done, right? And trying to think of getting feedback around past activities by being like, I'm not putting my current self out there, my vulnerable self right now out there. I'm throwing my old self under the bus, but it doesn't really matter because old self doesn't exist anymore. So if that's maybe a way to kind of think about it, if you're nervous about trying to put your hand up or getting feedback, think about it in terms of focus on an action that you took, that past you took.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's,
you know,
certainly important to know, and certainly, you know, a good way of looking at it. And I think as well, to make sure that you understand that mistakes are expected. Like nobody, if you're getting feedback from somebody and they say nothing bad, they say nothing that could be improved, I don't want to listen to that person. I'm not interested. If that's what they say, it's just like, okay, you know, it's nice to have somebody saying something nice about you. But honestly, and I'm not saying this just to try and be, I genuinely am not interested in somebody saying, oh, that was so good. And it's just like, I want to know how I can get better at it. What that's very nice that you think it was great, but what can be better? Because, you know, I'm confident enough as an adult, as a human being, to be able to go, that's really nice, I know it was good, but what can be better? And that's the important thing. I'm expecting to have made a mistake doing something. Did I talk too long? Did I say the wrong thing? Or did I say something, you know, there's something that I can do better out of what I just did. And I want to know what it is, because that's where the improvement comes in. It's lovely that you're going to say something nice. There's the leadership principle of, you know, the whatever it is, the sandwich of praise and criticism and praise. Again, it's just like, we all know what it is. I'm not really interested in the bit. Just tell me the criticism bit, because that's what I'm really interested in. That's what's going to benefit me, and that's what's going to help me. Well, one of the things in my previous job, when I was a police officer, we used to have to do these exercises, and I won't go into the boring details of it, but we used to have to do these exercises during some training, and you had to do it in teams of 1, 2, 3, and 4. So obviously one's not a team, but in 2, 3s, and 4s. And the more people that you get into the team, the more difficult it is. It's so difficult, and nobody, and I mean nobody, ever does it correctly the first few times. And it was one of the things I learned. It taught me so much about teamwork and mistakes and moving on from the things you do wrong there. It was the biggest lesson I learned in my life, because not only did I make mistakes, but in that kind of culture, and it's a weird culture, but we would naturally look for any element, even like a hair being out of place, just so that we can poke fun at each other, just so that we can kind of take each other down, go, ah, you've done this, you know, in a jokey way. But when we were in this context and we were doing it, like, you know, focused on the task at hand and in a professional way, we made big mistakes that would have cost, like, you know, a lot of marks, and not a single person said anything about it or thought anything detrimental towards the person that was making that mistake, for 2 reasons, I think. One, because you're part of a team and you're trying to achieve a goal where you know that you're all going to make a mistake. But also, secondly, I know that I could take the mick out of that person doing what they just did, but in a minute, I am almost certainly going to make the same mistake or something very similar. And it's not about taking somebody down. It's not about being better than somebody else or being worse than somebody else. It's about, what do we do as a team when that happens? Doesn't matter who, like, I wouldn't be able to tell you who did what wrong in those exercises. All I'd be able to tell you is that happened. I don't know who did it, but then we cope with it by doing this. And this is kind of what we need to understand when we're joining a team as a junior person, as a senior person, where we're basically going in there to do as good a job as we can. And when we make mistakes, not if we make mistakes, when we make mistakes, or when our weaknesses show through, we cope with it, we move on, and we deal with it. It's irrelevant as to who did it, to a degree. I mean, if it's a permanent level of underperformance and failure, then that kind of has to get looked at. But if you're kind of having somebody that is, you know, struggling the normal amount or like that sort of thing, we don't look at who's doing it wrong. We don't go, oh, you did this. We just go, this happened. Regardless of the team.
Yeah.
This is
the past. The idea of it's the past.
It happened.
And now we just fix it, right?
And now we move on because we fix it, because in a minute, it's irrelevant really who did it. It's irrelevant that you did it or that I did it. the relevant is it happened, this is how we deal with it, and we move on. It doesn't really matter. And that's the teamwork side of thing, where the leadership principles get involved in that. The only people that ever really fail in that are the ones that get hung up about the mistakes or start trying to point fingers as to you did this, or they never make it in team. Like, they never make it in any kind of team. It's always the ones that just basically go, this happened, let's get on with it, and we move forward.
We move forward. I'm wondering, Dale, would it be worth, maybe, because I think we've covered quite a lot, just finishing up maybe around interview questions, and this, we were talking earlier about this idea of, as an individual contributor, which is what companies like to be looking for now, but a little bit more practical, I suppose, around the competencies that companies would commonly use to test leadership skills for people kind of coming straight out of college, and what they're kind of assessing.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of zero in or put a closer spotlight on what you're looking at there, I think I have spoken to lots of people in School of Computing that have come to me and have said, can we have some sort of input on leadership? Because I've had interviews with Amazon is one of them. I've had interviews with Amazon where they've asked me about leadership principles, but I'm not going for a leadership role. I'm not managing anyone, and I don't really know what they're asking me about. So this is kind of one of the areas that we had said, like, we'd like to kind of share a little bit on, and maybe we'll look at this a little bit more in depth at another time or in a different format. I would certainly like to get at least a little bit of input in this put into our careers syllabus if we can at some point, but certainly is what we'll focus on now, is that what are companies on about, or what are they asking for when they're talking about leadership principles to people that aren't going for leadership roles? And we're not even talking about HR roles now where people are coming for you. We're just talking about a member of a team showing leadership principles. The first thing to, I suppose, mention is that this is not them asking, can we make this person a leader in a few years' time? This is not your suitability for a management position down the road. This is about them asking you why you are the sort of employee that others would like to emulate. One of the things I think is a good thing to ask in interview, and I've asked this in interviews that I've been for, is I'll ask the manager of the hiring manager, like, who on your team is really good at their job, and who's one of your best members of your team in your eyes, and why is it that they are good? I don't really want to know their names. I just want to know what qualities it is that they possess that make you think they're really good. Yeah, because that gives you an idea of then what they look for as a manager. If you do get the job, that will help you to understand what is going to go down well in your review, because you've turned up and you've basically you've got all the qualities, because you already know what they think is a good person on the team. So you've got an inside view on it. This is what people are looking for. This is what companies are looking for when they're talking about leadership qualities. They're talking about the qualities that they look for, or that you might look for, you think other companies should be looking for in an employee that others want to emulate. Yeah. What is it about me that makes others want to be like me in this team? What is it about me that managers look at and go, we'll give this to Dale because we need it to be done right, or we'll just give it. What makes you the reliable member of the team and puts you in a position where if anybody else was to ask your hiring manager or your manager in their interview, who is a good member of that team, they think of you. This is what we're talking about in terms of leadership qualities in companies like Amazon. Now, you do have to do a little bit of research yourself, because obviously you want to know what the values that they have. Most companies have, their principles, the leadership principles that they look for. If you go on the Amazon website, there's about 14 different qualities that they kind of talk about being leadership qualities in there. You go on the Microsoft website, there's 3. So you do have to do your own little bit of research, because you need to be able to tie in your experience and your work ethic, your ethos, your values to what they, help them to understand how you and they are similar. So that's one of the first things I would say, is start to understand what they're looking for. But then secondly, start to understand what it is that a company in general, not just the one you're interviewing for, but companies in generally are looking for in an employee. One of the things I have I've said in my lessons on interviewing and also applications to roles, is like, you know, you should look to be the person that you would love to work with. You know, when you turn up on your first day, or you turn up to work, who is it, like in your previous jobs, if you've had any, who is it that you really look forward to working with? Is it somebody that is just, oh, that's not my fault, it's not my responsibility, or, you know, the moaner, the whinger, the person that is just like, they're there for the paycheck, they do the absolute minimum? But, or do you prefer working with the person that comes in and they're positive, they're getting on with things, let's try this, let's make this better by doing that? Like, these are the people that you want to emulate. These are the leadership, these are the leaders, the people that you want to be like. This is the leadership qualities that people are looking for, and this is kind of what is being asked of you by the likes of these companies that are asking about what your thoughts are on leadership principles, or how you have demonstrated leadership ability before. So when it comes to these sort of things, when Amazon or Microsoft or Google or Facebook or any other company, really, you know, you see it quite a lot in tech companies, because the world looks to them really to see kind of like, you know, the progression, that they're seen as cutting edge, you know. So this is kind of why these areas come up in these companies specifically. But how are you going to demonstrate this on an application? How are you going to demonstrate this on a CV, and also in an interview? The first thing I would say is certainly you need to have your ducks in a row. You need to be living that yourself. You know, you need to be the sort of person that you can truthfully say, I don't tend to do this, or I do tend to do that. This is what I generally do to make myself the best I can be, and hopefully bring others with me. And I think that's a really important thing. But then secondly, it's all about evidencing it again on your applications, bringing those elements of leadership in, especially if it's on the job spec, or you know it's a company that is big on leadership principles. You need to kind of have a little bit of that in your application. And secondly, thirdly, when you're preparing for your interviews, have these things ready, have these examples ready. They are as important as, you know, your job spec stuff that you know you're going to get asked about. So how do you describe leadership? What is leadership to you? And how have you demonstrated that in your previous job? How have you demonstrated that in your classroom, in your areas of work where you've been studying? Most people that are listening to this will have been in scenarios where they are working on projects with other people. How have you been a leader in that position? And I'm not talking about telling somebody what to do. I'm talking about leading by example. I think a lot of it, I don't know who it is, there's a company that refers to it as servant leadership, you know, being the one who sets the example of how to be a good team member, or a good, you know, a good follower. And that's,
I might jump in there. Just
yeah, I have talked for quite a bit there. Say that for
talked for like a long time there, Dale. But I think so. Like, we can probably. So I think the advice of you do need to look up what companies are looking for, because all companies are going to have different twists on what leadership looks like. But I do think, in a general sense, right, if you want to do some general interview preparation and you're trying to work out yourself, where have I maybe demonstrated leadership because I haven't been in an obvious leadership position, there are maybe 3 kind of key competencies that I would say are worth thinking about and sort of trying to prepare examples for. So one of them, I would say, which is the most important, is accountability. And accountability disguises itself as responsibility, as taking ownership, as initiative. It hides under a lot of things, but ultimately what it comes down to is, are you able to follow through on commitments that you've made to yourself and to others? Can you take personal responsibility for mistakes, but also for successes, right? Can you work with other people to determine what the expectations are in a group setting, or in any sort of work environment? Can you figure out how to measure results, or what you're even trying to achieve? And can you take accountability for setting those standards for yourself, right? And are you able to actually get feedback or give feedback if you are going for a manager position? So I think accountability and demonstrating accountability, whether that's from completing your thesis and independently doing research, or completing a project in college, or improving something in your workplace, all of those things where you've taken some sort of accountability for your own actions are really good ways to start thinking about, how can I put an example together of positive leadership, right? So I'd say that's a very self-centered kind of one, but I think it's really good to think about that to start with. The second one that I'd say is really important is in a wider team sense. So it's about how can you communicate and collaborate with other people? Because if you can effectively communicate, you're potentially demonstrating leadership skills because you're able to persuade other people to do things, or you're leading by effectively getting people to do what you need them to do. And that might be within your team or across a different team. And in big companies, you have to work in cross teams all of the time. So being able to work in those different contexts and with people at different levels is really, really important. So if you can do that, you're also demonstrating leadership. So just again, like some examples maybe around that might be, you can listen actively and attentively. And we've already talked about the importance of listening, that you are able to adapt how you speak to people based on the audience. So you might speak to clients differently to how you speak to your manager or how you speak to somebody in a different team. You might be able to be somebody who's really good at getting other people to contribute to a conversation who might not put their hand up. Yeah. So things like that can be really, really good in terms of how do you actually communicate with people. Maybe that you partner with other people to get work done. So you're not trying to do everything on your own. Maybe you've recognized, okay, I'm really good at this, but I'm actually not great at that. So maybe if I can get Dale to do this thing with me, we'll take the best of what we're both good at and provide something even better. So it is about that working with other people, and again, identifying what can I do and really contribute, but what maybe can I not do and put my hand up and ask for help with, and using that as well. So the first thing, accountability. Second thing, communicating and collaborating with people. And then I would say the third thing, which we've talked about a lot, is that self-awareness piece. And thinking, when have I been self-aware enough to ask for help, to get feedback, to recognize where I didn't do something as well as I could and to try and improve it, and to be really aware of those strengths and weaknesses. And sometimes those strengths and weaknesses questions of what are your greatest strengths and what are your weaknesses, they all have to do with leadership and how you manage optimizing your strengths and in a way minimizing or balancing out your weaknesses in certain areas. So I'd say if you're kind of stuck on how to think, do I have leadership experience, focus on those three areas, because you should be able to come up with something within that you can talk about in an interview situation.
A lot of it boils down to your personal responsibility for yourself, but to an admirable level. Like, basically, what do you do that you would be happy for, or your manager would be happy for other people to also do, like you know, be like Mike or whatever, it's just like, what do you do that is that sets a good example, and it is a way of doing it. That is a really, like, there's all these things that, like, they'll always be looking for you to, like, self-improvement and be curious and be like, take ownership of your work and be honest and open, all those sort of things. But essentially it all boils down to, what would they want other people to do just in the same way as you've done? And that's leadership. And we're not in a managerial position, not in a managerial way. It's just, how are you the best team member? What makes you the best team member? And if you think about it in those terms, if you think about the team that you're going on, or the team that you currently work in, whether it's academically or whether it's professionally, it's like, you think about the best people in that area. What is it that they do that makes you think they're great? That's leadership, that you're thinking, you're influenced by that person. So what is it that they do, and then start thinking along those lines. What is it that I could possibly do that other people would be thinking? Why would anybody else think I want to do what Dale does in that sense? Because he's really good in that area. Now, for me, it's everything, that's
yeah, absolutely everything. Dale, God, like, I wish I just
especially being succinct into the
maybe more like Dale.
But so that's kind of to clarify for those of you that have kind of been a little bit confused by the questioning that's come in from the likes of the tech companies looking for your leadership qualities. This is the sort of thing that they're looking for. It's not about getting a sense of whether you're suitable to lead a team in a couple of years' time. They may well do that, but this is not what the questioning is about. The questioning is about, how are you a model team member or a model follower? There's the school of thought that is the best leaders are the best followers. This is the most influential leaders are the best followers, and that is really something that is very true.
And I think that example that you give, right, it doesn't have to be an earth-shattering example of being a good leader, right? It can be a very simple example of, you know, I worked in a team and the team leader was really, you know, pushing forward ideas and was basically putting a plan together with one other person contributing. So what I did was I encouraged a better format for brainstorming, which allowed everyone to contribute on the team. And then we ended up picking out the best, you know, like that's not a very huge thing to do, but it is showing leadership in helping improve a team dynamic and encouraging other people to think. So examples like that are very small, and it doesn't have to be, as I said, earth-shattering, but those are strong examples of leadership in the context of collaboration, which we talked about as one of those ways to demonstrate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's probably a very good way of putting it, actually. Yeah. Great.
Will we wrap up?
I think we've probably covered everything now, haven't we?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about everything, but if you want to look up more around leadership, there are definitely good resources. Forbes has a good few articles that they've written about kind of like leadership qualities and how to develop them, and examples with like CVs and cover letters on how to write about what you've actually achieved and where you've had an impact. If you want to look up strengths, Gallup is the company that did the research, so those are really interesting if you're trying to figure out what your own strengths are, and how you can sort of maximize talking about it. They might be good to look at as well. But yeah, leadership matrices and rubrics and stuff can also be helpful just in understanding like what it is a company looks for. But as Dale said many times, it's really important that as you're applying for each company, do look and see what their own values are, because they will change company to company, and understanding their own leadership values will really help inform you as to how to answer those interview questions as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll wrap up. Next week is week 6, so it's actually our last week of series 1 of the Career Conversations. So we'll post this up and then we'll join you next week, and then we will hopefully do a series 2 in the future as well. Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dale.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Good to speak to you.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.
Bye.